Welcome to Echo and Ash, and thank you for tuning in to another original audio experience. Today we are continuing our storyline titled Silent Breath. This is episode 4. Please sit back, relax, and let the story unfold.
The oceanic serenade, once a glowing beacon of celebration, was now a silent, darkened monolith cutting a slow, agonizing path through the Pacific Ocean, maintaining a strict 100 nautical miles from the South American coastline. The ship's exterior lighting had been extinguished on the captain's orders, an attempt to conserve auxiliary power as the engineering department wrestled with the failing environmental systems. It was 3 a.m., and the luxury liner was operating under the grim, undeniable reality of a Level 4 quarantine. In cabin 1042, a mid-tier stateroom on Deck 10, David and Sarah Miller lay awake in the oppressive darkness. The Millers were a young, affluent couple from Chicago, celebrating their 5th wedding anniversary. Just 8 hours prior, they had been drinking martinis by the aft pool, laughing at a comedian in the theater. Now, they were prisoners in a 200-square-foot room. "David, it's so hot," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. She kicked the heavy, high-thread-count duvet to the foot of the bed. She was wearing only a thin silk nightgown, but her skin was slick with sweat. David sat up, rubbing his eyes. The room was unnervingly quiet. The constant comforting hum of the air conditioning unit, the sound that usually masked the creak of the ship's hull and the rush of the ocean, was gone. The air in the cabin was stagnant, thick, and heavy with an unbearable tropical humidity. "I'll check the thermostat again," David said, his voice laced with the same frustration that had been building since the captain's terrifying announcement at the gala. He swung his legs out of bed and walked over to the digital panel on the wall. He tapped the screen. The small LCD display illuminated the dark room with a faint blue glow. It read 84 degrees. "It's not working, Sarah. It's totally dead," David said, slapping his hand against the wall. "The captain said the public spaces were closed. He didn't say they were shutting off the life support. We pay $10,000 for this suite, and we're supposed to roast in the dark?" "David, please stop yelling," Sarah pleaded, sitting up. She pressed her hands against her chest. "It's hard enough to breathe as it is." David froze, his anger instantly evaporating, replaced by a sudden icy spike of genuine terror. "What do you mean it's hard to breathe? Are you feeling sick?" No, Sarah said quickly, shaking her head. She took a deliberate, albeit shallow, breath. It's so humid. The air feels thick, like breathing in a sauna, that's all." David let out a long breath, trying to slow his racing heart. The rumors of a virus had spread through the ship like wildfire before the lockdown. "We need to get some air moving. I'm going to open the balcony door." The captain's announcement said to keep all exterior doors closed, Sarah warned. The captain's announcement said a lot of things. "Right now, we need air," David said firmly. He walked to the heavy sliding glass door, unlocked the latch, and pulled it open. The immediate rush of the ocean breeze was a welcome relief, but it was not the crisp, cool air of a typical night at sea. They were sailing near the equator. The wind coming off the Pacific was warm and heavy, saturated with moisture. Still, it was movement. It was better than the suffocating stagnation of the cabin. David stepped out onto the small, private balcony, gripping the teak railing. He looked out into the absolute blackness of the ocean, searching for the lights of another ship, the glow of a coastline, anything to prove they weren't entirely alone. There was nothing. Just an endless void of dark water. He looked up and down the massive curved side of the oceanic serenade. Usually at this hour, a few night owls would be out on their balconies, smoking cigars or watching the waves. Tonight, every balcony was dark. The ship felt utterly abandoned. a ghost ship carrying 4,000 terrified souls. Deep below the passenger decks, in the cavernous, grease-stained labyrinth of the engine room, Chief Engineer Elias Cobb was fighting a losing battle against the laws of thermodynamics. The space was deafeningly loud, a symphony of massive diesel generators and churning turbines. But Cobb wasn't focused on the propulsion systems. He was standing in front of the primary HVAC control panel, a massive bank of analog dials and digital readouts that monitored the ship's climate control. Marcus Vance's order to switch to 100% outside air had been a desperate gamble to stop the airborne spread of the pathogen, but it was a mechanical suicide mission. The ship's massive chiller units, the colossal industrial air conditioners designed to cool recirculated, semi-conditioned air, were now trying to freeze the humid, 85-degree ocean air being sucked in from the exterior intake valves. "Chief!" yelled Higgins, a young junior engineer whose overalls were soaked in sweat. He pointed a greasy finger at a large trembling dial. "Compressor Unit 4 is redlining. The coolant temperature is spiking. The coils are freezing up from the humidity." "Bypass the safety sensors," Cobb roared over the din of the machinery. "Keep it running." "If I bypass the sensors, the compressor head will warp," Higgins shouted back, his eyes wide with panic. "It will tear itself apart, Chief. We'll lose the entire cooling loop for the starboard side." Cobb wiped his face with a rag, staring at the rapidly climbing temperature gauges. He knew Higgins was right. The machines were screaming in agony. They were being asked to do the impossible. "Shut it down," Cobb finally ordered, his voice heavy with defeat. "Shut down Unit 4 and Unit 2. We have to preserve the core chillers for the medical bay and the bridge. Reroute whatever cooling capacity we have left to Deck 3. "What about the passenger decks, Chief?" Higgins asked, his hand hovering over the heavy red kill switches. "They get nothing," Cobb said grimly. "The fans will still push air, but it will be unconditioned outside air. The passenger cabins are going to turn into ovens." Higgins pulled the switches. A deep, resonant mechanical groan echoed through the engine room as two of the massive chillers spun down and died. The sacrifice had been made. The medical bay would stay cool, but the rest of the ship was about to experience the brutal reality of the equatorial climate. Up on Deck 3, the medical center was a scene of controlled, desperate horror. The air conditioning was still blasting, a stark contrast to the rising heat in the rest of the ship, but the cold air offered little comfort to the dying. Dr. Marcus Vance stood in the center of the main ward, holding a clipboard that felt incredibly heavy. The situation had spiraled far beyond a localized outbreak. It was a mass casualty event. There were now 32 patients in the medical bay. The 5 ventilators were occupied. Arthur Pendleton, the elderly man who had brought the virus aboard, had died 2 hours ago, his heart finally giving out under the strain. Julian, the young dishwasher, was clinging to life on Arthur's ventilator. The other 4 machines were keeping the sous chef, Hector, and 3 other crew members alive. The remaining 27 patients were scattered across examination tables, waiting room chairs, and the floor, all hooked up to the dwindling supply of portable oxygen tanks. The silence of their suffering was agonizing. There was no screaming, no coughing, just the terrifying, shallow gasping of dozens of people slowly drowning in the dry, sterile air. Elena Rostova, her scrubs stained with sweat and her eyes bloodshot, approached Marcus. She held a small green metal cylinder. It was empty. "That was the last of the portable E-tanks, Doctor," Elena reported, her voice completely flat, stripped of all emotion by sheer exhaustion. "We have tapped into the main liquid oxygen reserve. According to the flow rates, we have maybe 18 hours of oxygen left for the entire ship." Marcus closed his eyes, the brutal mathematics of the situation locking into place. 18 hours. The Valparaiso Port Authority had denied them entry. The World Health Organization was still coordinating a response, which, in bureaucratic terms, meant they were debating who should take the blame. They were entirely on their own. "Dr. Vance," a weak voice called out. Marcus opened his eyes and looked down. Sitting on the floor near his feet, leaning against a white cabinet, was a woman named Maria. She was a cabin steward from Deck 6, a mother of 3 from the Philippines. Her face was a stark cyanotic blue. Her chest was barely moving. She wasn't on oxygen. They didn't have enough to give her a tank. They were saving it for those whose saturations were dropping below 60%. Maria was hovering at 65. Marcus knelt down beside her, taking her cold, trembling hand. "I'm here, Maria. Try to stay calm. Try to take slow breaths." Maria looked at him, her eyes wide with a profound, terrifying clarity. She knew she was dying. "It is so heavy," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "The air, it is too heavy to lift." "I know," Marcus said softly, his own heart breaking. "I know." Maria closed her eyes. Her chest stopped moving entirely. The silent breath had finally stopped. Marcus checked her pulse. There was nothing. He gently laid her hand down on her lap. He stood up, looking at Elena. He didn't have to say a word. Elena nodded slowly, walking over with a white sheet to cover the woman's face. It was the 3rd death of the night. "Marcus," Captain Sterling's voice crackled over the intercom speaker mounted on the wall. "I need you on the bridge." Marcus looked at the crowded, dying ward. He looked at the sheet covering Maria. He was the chief medical officer. His place was here, fighting for every inch of lung capacity his patients had left. But the tone of Sterling's voice suggested that the crisis was no longer confined to the medical bay. "Elena, you have the ward. Page me if anyone else crashes, but do not use the main oxygen reserve unless their saturation drops below 50, Marcus ordered. It was a death sentence for anyone hovering in the 60s, but he had to stretch the supply. Marcus left the freezing medical center and stepped out into the main corridor of Deck 3. The contrast was shocking. The hallway, usually crisp and cool, was stiflingly hot. The air felt thick, smelling faintly of stale sweat and the metallic tang of the ocean. The HVAC system was pumping unconditioned, humid air directly into the enclosed spaces. He ran to the crew elevator, overriding the passenger lock, and rode it up to the bridge. When the elevator doors opened, the bridge was bathed in the ominous red glow of the emergency lighting. Rain lashed violently against the massive panoramic windows. A sudden, unpredicted squall had blown in from the west, tossing the massive ship on unpredictable swells. Captain Sterling was standing over the main radar console, his hands gripping the edges so hard his knuckles were white. First Officer Davies stood beside him, looking pale and deeply shaken. "What is it, Thomas?" Marcus asked, stepping onto the bridge. "Are the chillers failing?" "The chillers have failed on the passenger decks," Sterling said, not looking up from the radar screen. "The cabins are reaching 90 degrees, but that is not why I called you." Sterling stepped aside, pointing to a flashing red light on a secondary communications console. It was the ship's internal emergency line, a dedicated circuit that bypassed the purser's desk and rang directly to the bridge. It was designed to be used only by crew members in the event of a fire, a hull breach, or a violent crime. "The purser's desk has been completely overwhelmed with calls from passengers complaining about the heat," Sterling explained, his voice tight. "So they started using the emergency pull stations in the hallways." Marcus looked at the flashing red light. "And they are hot and angry. We knew this would happen." "Listen," Sterling said. He reached over and pressed a button on the console, routing the incoming call to the bridge's main overhead speakers. The audio crackled with static, followed by the sound of a woman crying hysterically. It wasn't the angry, entitled screaming of a passenger complaining about a ruined vacation. It was the raw, primal sound of absolute terror. "Please, please, somebody answer," the woman sobbed. "I need a doctor. My husband, he won't wake up. He was just complaining about the heat, and now he won't wake up. His lips are blue. Please." Marcus felt a cold spike of dread drive itself directly into his spine. "What cabin is she calling from?" Marcus asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Cabin 1042, First Officer Davies replied, reading the digital display. "Deck 10, midship." Marcus stared at the speaker. Deck 10. The virus had started on Deck 8 with the old man. It had moved to the galleys on Deck 2. It had devastated the crew quarters on Deck 1. And now, despite the quarantine, despite the engineers crippling the HVAC system, it had reached the upper echelons of the passenger decks. The virus hadn't just used the ventilation system. It had saturated the ship. The forced recirculation of the air over the last 48 hours had essentially seeded every cabin, every corridor, and every dining room with the microscopic aerosolized pathogen. The woman on the radio continued to sob, begging for a doctor, begging for someone to help her husband breathe. "How many other emergency calls have we received?" Marcus asked, turning to Sterling. Sterling looked at the chief medical officer, his eyes reflecting the red emergency lights, making him look like a man staring into the fires of hell. "In the last 20 minutes?" Sterling asked, his voice breaking. 47, from every passenger deck on the ship. Marcus backed away from the console. The math was no longer complex. It was simply apocalyptic. They had 18 hours of oxygen. They had 5 ventilators. And they had thousands of people locked in sweltering, un-air-conditioned boxes, slowly realizing that the heavy, humid air they were breathing was entirely devoid of life. The Oceanic Serenade was no longer a ship in quarantine. It was a tomb.
Thank you for listening to this episode, and if you enjoyed the story, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for the continuation of this series as the unseen threat begins to spread through the ship. Until then, stay safe, and thanks for listening.